Hello Physios, so this is the second part of my stretching series. I have already uploaded part 1 and if you haven't watched that yet, then you can watch it out. I will upload the I button here somewhere and you can click over there and you can watch that video. And if you want to watch any of my exercise therapy videos, then you can go to the playlist. I have created exercise therapy playlist in my channel, so you can go there and watch any of my exercise therapy videos. So now let's start with stretching of lower limbs. So first I will tell you piriformis stretching. So it performs abduction, extension and external rotation of hip. So for its stretching, we will perform just opposite of these functions. So patient will be in supine line and we will bring hip and knee in flexion. And at this point, you have to externally rotate the hip. I will tell you the reason behind that, but now you have to trust me and you have to note this point, and then you have to adduct the hip. You have to bring the knee towards the opposite shoulder. So now you have to adduct the hip. So I am pushing the knee towards the opposite shoulder. So this is the stretching of piriformis. Now I will tell you why I externally rotated the hip after 90 degree of hip flexion. The reason behind that is piriformis is such a special muscle that after 90 degree of hip flexion, it start working as internal rotators, and that's the reason why after flexing the hip beyond 90 degree, I externally rotated the hip and then I pushed it towards the opposite shoulder, because after 90 degrees piriformis start working as internal rotators. So after 90 degrees of hip flexion, I externally rotated the hip and pushed the knee towards the opposite shoulder to stretch that piriformis muscle. Now I will tell you how to stretch hip adductors. Those are adductor magnus, minimus, adductor longus, adductor brevis, pectineus muscle and gracilis. So to stretch those muscles bilaterally, that means if I have to stretch those muscles of both limbs, then the patient will be in crook line as you can see, and therapist will abduct those limbs. So I will abduct both the limbs and this stretch will stretch both the muscles in both the limbs. So this is a bilateral stretch. It will stretch adductor muscles of both limbs. But if you want to perform a unilateral stretch, that means you want to perform a stretch of only one limb, then there are two methods of doing so. My one hand will stabilize the ASIS and with my other hand I will apply a abducting force. So my one hand is just stabilizing the pelvis and with my other hand I am abducting unilateral adductor muscles. You have to sustain this stretch for at least 15 to 20 seconds and you can do 6 to 5 repetitions. This is also a test, Faber's test, to identify sacroiliac joint dysfunction. So if you see someone doing this, then it can be possible that they are performing a test called Faber's test to identify SI joint dysfunction. Now there is one more method to perform unilateral stretch of adductor muscle. For this, patient will hold his one leg in flexion position and his other leg will be hanging freely out of the couch. You can see the patient position. So to stretch those adductor muscles, I will apply a abductor and extension force. So you can see I am applying a abductor and extension force to stretch those unilateral adductor muscles, and patient is stabilizing his pelvis by flexing his hip joint. So this is the way you have to stretch your adductor muscles. So now I will tell you stretching of sartorius muscle. So sartorius muscle at hip joint performs flexion, abduction and external rotation function, and at knee joint it performs flexion and internal rotation function. So to stretch it, I will perform just opposite of these functions. First, I will adduct the limb which I have to stretch because it does the function of abduction. So I will do just opposite of this function. And then after adducting, I will flex the knee joint, as you can see, and after flexing it, I will internally rotate the hip joint. So you can see I am internally rotating the hip joint because sartorius externally rotate the hip joint. So to stretch it, I am internally rotating the hip joint. So this is the way you have to do sartorius stretch. Now I will tell you how to stretch calf muscles. So basically calf muscles are made from two muscles, gastrocnemius and soleus muscle. So first I will tell you how to stretch soleus muscle. So soleus muscle perform just plantar flexion function at ankle joint. So to stretch it, I will flex the knee about 20 to 30 degrees because gastrocnemius muscle also perform function of knee flexion. So just to eliminate the function of gastrocnemius, I am flexing knee joint about 30 to 20 degrees. So this point you have to remember. So to stretch soleus, my one hand will be below the calcaneus and I will apply a dorsiflexion force. So you can see I am applying a dorsiflexion force to stretch those soleus muscles. Now I will tell you how to perform gastrocnemius stretch. So for this, the knees will be extended because gastrocnemius also assists in knee flexion. That's why knees are extended, and I will dorsiflex the ankle joint because gastrocnemius plantar flexes the ankle joint. So I am doing just opposite of these functions. So I have to stretch the same way I did for soleus muscle. Now I will tell you stretching of tibialis anterior. So it does the function of dorsiflexion and supination of ankle joint. So to stretch this muscle, I will perform just opposite of these functions. So to stretch it, I am plantar flexing and pronating the ankle joint, and with my other hand, I am stretching that belly of tibialis anterior away from its insertion. And this method will give such a good stretch to the patient. I just want you guys to try this method and it will give such a good stretch to the patient. You just have to grab the medial border of foot and you have to plantar flex and pronate the foot, and with your other hand you have to just stretch that belly of that muscle away from its insertion, and it will give a good stretch to the tibialis anterior muscle. Now I will tell you stretching of extensor digitorum longus, not brevis, remember this. So for longus, it does the function of dorsiflexion at toes and dorsiflexion and pronation at ankle joint. So to stretch extensor digitorum longus, I will do just opposite of these functions. So I will grab all these 4 toes and I will perform function of plantar flexion at toes and plantar flexion and supination at ankle joint. It will give such a good stretch, and with your other hand you have to just move the belly opposite away from its insertion, and it will give a good stretch at extensor digitorum longus. If you are just plantar flexing the toes and you are not moving the ankle joint, then it is just stretching extensor digitorum brevis, because brevis does not act at ankle joint. So this thing you have to remember. So if you will not involve the ankle joint, it will not stretch extensor digitorum longus, it will just stretch brevis muscle. Now I will tell you stretching of extensor hallucis longus. So this is the stretching of big toe. So it does the function of dorsiflexion at big toe and dorsiflexion and supination at ankle joint. So to stretch the big toe, I will perform just opposite of these functions. So what I will do, plantar flexion at big toe and plantar flexion and pronation at ankle joint. And with my other hand, I am just stretching the belly of extensor hallucis longa away from its insertion. So this is the way you have to do stretching of extensor hallucis longus muscle. Now I will tell you stretching of interossei muscles. So there are two types of interossei muscles, dorsalis interossei and plantaris. First I will tell you stretching of dorsalis. So dorsalis does the function of abduction of toes and plantar flexion at metatarsal phalangeal joint. So to stretch it, I will adduct the toes and I will do dorsiflexion at MTP joint. Now for interossei plantaris muscle, it performs the function of adduction of toes and plantar flexion at MTP joint. So to stretch it, I will adduct the toes. You can see how I adducted the toes. So adduct the toes and do the dorsiflexion at MTP joint. So this stretch will also stretch the lumbrical muscle, so you don't have to remember them separately.